God appears to Abraham for the purpose of testing him. The Lord God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac on a mountain that God would later show him. This had to have caused much confusion in the mind of Abraham. Isaac was the child through whom God said many descendants would come. These descendants would form a great nation and inherit the land of Canaan. How could these promises be fulfilled if Isaac died? Also, we know that God abhors human sacrifices. Leviticus chapter 18 verse 21, 20-1-5. Since God does not change, we can assume that Abraham was aware of God's feelings on this matter. Every reasonable thought would lead Abraham to question God's command. What Abraham could not know is that God's commandment would parallel a greater event in the future when God gave his own son to be the sacrifice on behalf of the world. Notice how God described Abraham's love for Isaac and notice how it parallels God's own love for his son. John chapter 17 verse 24. Instead of questioning God's sanity, Abraham goes immediately to fulfill the commandment. Looking at Hebrews chapter 11 verses 17-19, we learn how Abraham had the courage to do what God had asked of him. Since God said earlier that it was specifically through Isaac that his promises would be fulfilled, Abraham reasoned that the all-powerful God could still fulfill his promises by raising Isaac from the dead. Now Abraham's conclusion was wrong as to God's intent, but we see the strength of Abraham's faith. Abraham did not doubt that God was going to fulfill his promises that he had made to Abraham. The place chosen for the sacrifice was about 50 miles from Abraham's home. It took Abraham 3 days to reach the place. The journey gave Abraham 3 days to change his mind, but he did not relent. The place chosen was not arbitrary. It was a mountain called Moriah. Moriah is only mentioned in one other place in our Bibles, 2 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 1. This is the place where God appeared to David on the threshing floor. Later, this was the same place where Solomon built the temple. And a long time later, it was on this same mountain that God's only Son was sacrificed outside the gates of the city of Jerusalem. In preparing for the journey, Abraham brings everything he needs for the sacrifice. He doesn't give himself any excuse to delay fulfilling God's command. 2 servants accompanied Abraham to the mountain, but they were told to stay at the base of the mountain. Perhaps Abraham was making sure he would not be hindered in making the sacrifice. However, notice that Abraham told the servants that both he and Isaac would return to them. Abraham did not believe Isaac would stay dead on the mountain. Isaac carried the wood for the sacrificial fire up the mountain. This shows that Isaac is no longer a small child. He was old enough to climb a mountain with a large load of wood on his back. Most people estimate that Isaac was probably in his late teens or early 20s at this time. Notice the parallel to the sacrifice of Christ. Isaac carried the wood for his own sacrifice just as Jesus bore the crossbeam to his own sacrifice. Abraham bears the fire and the knife for the sacrifice, but Isaac wonders where the actual sacrifice was at. Abraham prophetically states that God would provide a sacrifice. Abraham avoids telling Isaac about God's command, perhaps to keep Isaac from running off. Yet once the altar is built and the wood is laid out, Abraham binds Isaac and places him on the altar. Before Abraham gives the killing blow with his knife, God stops the sacrifice. He waited until Abraham fully committed himself to prove that Abraham fully intended to obey God. God praises Abraham's devotion, which mirrors God's own devotion. John chapter 3 verse 16, 1 John chapter 4 verses 9-11. Abraham's devotion was to the God who loved him. God's devotion was to the people he created, the people who rejected him. Throughout these events we see the strength of Abraham's faith in the things that he did. James chapter 2 verses 21-24. God provides a ram for the sacrifice, as Abraham had predicted. Because of this, Abraham named the region, "God will provide." Eventually, God provided the true lamb for the ultimate sacrifice on behalf of the world. After this great sacrifice on Abraham's part, God gives Abraham the strongest promise that he can give. God swears an oath backed by himself, since there is nothing greater. Hebrews chapter 6 verses 13 to 18. Through the sacrifice of Jesus, we learn from God's actions the greatness of his love for us. Matthew chapter 10 verse 37. The promise to Abraham mentions the blessing of the nations through his seed and not seeds. Paul mentions this to prove that God was referring to Christ and not the nation of Israel. Galatians chapter 3 verse 16.